Now picture this, you're living in Tulsa, Oklahoma around early 2022 and you're thinking about buying a rental property. The pandemic is pretty much over at this point. Interest rates are still at all-time lows. So you go to this big conference hosted by some lady who calls herself the Queen of Airbnb to learn about whether or not buying an Airbnb property is a good plan for you. The numbers are better than you could ever imagine. The Queen tells you that you could make $30,000 per year if you bought a $75,000 suburban home. That's like a 40% return on your money, way better than you could ever make with a regular rental property or if you put your money in the stock market. But if you fell for the Queen's sales pitch on that cool winter morning, just 1 year later, you would be wrapped up in a huge mess as her entire empire came crumbling down. Danny Waddell built her career flipping houses and managing other people's Airbnbs, but by the end of it, she was accused of stealing from homeowners and fleeing town in a brand new Land Rover after facing accusations for harassment, fraud, and burglary. A lot to unpack with this one, and it is a fascinating story. Let's take a look at how this lady went from looking like this to looking like this. Like I said, she got started in the house flipping business out in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but she got into the Airbnb property management business somewhere around 2021. At the peak of her company, she claimed that she had around 100 listings under management, which made her the biggest Airbnb property manager in all of Tulsa. The business was doing well. Business Insider uncovered that Danny's company, Waddell Renovations, was generating over $1 million in annual bookings. And with this success, she started turning into a bit of an online guru where she was giving out short-term rental advice in Facebook groups. She was hosting these huge events, and she was basically trying to convince as many people as possible to convert their homes into Airbnbs and then hire her to be the property manager. Little side note though, $1 million in annual bookings sounds like a lot, but if she really had 100 listings under management and she was doing $1 million in bookings, that's actually kind of crazy. Like out here in Scottsdale, nice Airbnbs make about $100,000 per year each, sometimes even more than that. So you'd only need like 10 properties at the most to get to $1 million in annual gross revenue out here. It's all relative though. The average home price in Tulsa is about $200,000 and the average home price in Scottsdale is around $800,000. Some of you OGs from the channel might already know this, but I tried my hand at the whole Airbnb thing a while back. I converted my old house I used to live in into an Airbnb back in 2017, and I ran that thing as a short-term rental all the way up until the pandemic hit in 2020. Back then I was still working at the bank, so I was pretty busy during the day. I ended up hiring a property manager to help me just kind of oversee everything. She was responsible for all of it. She took care of the photos, created the listing for me, she handled all the tenant communication, she decided what the pricing should be, she dealt with turnover, she dealt with cleaning, she did the accounting, all of that. Airbnb property managers really do have a lot on their plates, and it's kind of funny. My property manager that I had back then kind of reminds me of this Danny girl. Like my property manager was managing my property plus literally about 100 other Airbnb properties across Scottsdale. And what happens if you're scaling a property management company fast like this when you don't have all the right systems in place and you haven't done all the right hiring is things can get really overwhelming really quick. Anyways, I ended up getting rid of my Airbnb, partly due to when the pandemic hit, I just saw my calendar get completely wiped out, which totally freaked me out. Plus, I was already feeling super frustrated with my property manager, so at the time, it just made sense to get out of the Airbnb game. Back to Danny Waddell, she got started around 2021, so she didn't really have the pandemic impacting her business in a negative way. Plus, at the time, Tulsa was an attractive place for Airbnbs. It's got a great art and architecture scene, lots of stuff to do, it's affordable, and a few years ago they actually started offering $10,000 to people who are willing to move to Tulsa to work remotely full-time, so I'm sure that also contributed to the Airbnb boom out there. What Danny was offering landlords and investors out in Tulsa was very attractive because basically what she was saying is that if you handed your house over to her and let her manage it as a short-term rental, then she would handle all of the overhead and you as the investor would be able to just collect a check every month. It would be a pretty passive source of income. After she had that big short-term rental event at the VFW hall, apparently the attendees were just all piling up, eager to have Danny manage their Airbnb rentals. The lady who hosted the event said that Danny made it feel like if you weren't already in the short-term rental game, it was gonna be too late. The way this would work if you signed up with Danny is if you owned a property or you bought a property that you wanted to hand over to her, she would, again, take over all the management of the Airbnb for you on day one. Let's say the property generated on average $2,500 per month in gross rental income. Danny would then collect all of that rent from all the different guests who check in and check out. She would pay all of the expenses for repairs and cleaning and maintenance and all that stuff. She would take her management fee for her services. Short-term rental managers typically charged around 20% at the time. And finally, after all that, she'd cut you, the owner, a check at the end of every month for whatever was left, probably somewhere around $1,500. Short-term rental management is a solid business model, it's a profitable business model, and it's a great service for investors. So because of that, Danny was becoming a little bit of a local celebrity for what she was doing. She was featured on the cover of Tulsa magazine in 2018. She was living the high life. I guess she was a member of Tulsa's only private social club where she hung around the local elite. This was also right around when she cut her hair short and she swapped out her conservative style for a more flashy style. It didn't take long though before Danny's entire operation came crumbling down. Within a year of her kicking off this business, owners weren't receiving those rent checks anymore. Employees who worked for Danny weren't getting paid their paychecks. Danny's marriage also fell apart. A slew of property owners started to come forward at this time when they started to notice a bunch of weird irregularities with the way that Danny was running her business. Some owners said that their utilities at their homes were disconnected, a sign that Danny wasn't paying the bills. Another owner filed a lawsuit in 2022 and claimed that Danny owed her over $85,000 after she discovered a bunch of accounting issues. Then there was this other guy who said that he paid Danny $10,800 to stage his property and manage his short-term rental. But then he started to notice this pattern where people would book his property, then Danny would cancel the booking and have the guest rebook at one of her other own personal properties. Now, I wasn't able to pinpoint exactly where things went wrong here. Like, how do you go from managing 100 properties to all of a sudden everything just falling apart? My best guess is that Danny just scaled her business way too fast. Like, if you've got 100 rentals under management, you need a solid team in place to help you out with that. You need some really strong systems in place. I'm guessing that she just didn't structure her business to handle this whole new workload, and it caught up with her. As everything started to fall apart, former employees and tenants just flat out couldn't get a hold of Danny anymore after February. She changed the locks on her business, she bought a new car, and she told her employees that she planned to, quote unquote, start a new life. There were several protective orders filed against her because before she fled town, she showed up at former employees' apartment buildings yelling, banging on doors, and she had a gun in her hand. Then shortly after that, her now ex-husband had the same thing happen to him. She showed up at their former home, also with a gun, acting erratically. A few of Danny's former employees actually approached her and confronted her at one of her rental properties before she fled town. I guess they were just trying to figure out exactly why all these employees weren't getting paid, and Danny's response was very aggressive. I guess she was hiring a lot of former people who were like felons that had been to prison at the time, and this whole interaction was caught on camera.
I don't give a hang on. It doesn't matter. It does not matter what he thinks. It does not matter. He cannot ever show up to my office to scream at me, because I will call the police. He will be forcibly removed, and he will lose custody of his child. I can use the legal system to my advantage. I know how to use the legal system to my advantage. Do you know how many people that work here that don't want to go back to prison or jail? All of them.
Interesting strategy. So she was hiring people who have been to prison so that if they were to do anything wrong with her, she could threaten them to send them back to prison. I know there's a lot of people out there who are not thrilled about Airbnb investors and Airbnbs taking over their neighborhood, but this whole situation is really not cool for any of those people who did put their house up for rent with Danny. Like, if you bought a property solely to rent it out on Airbnb and you thought you were gonna make around $2,500 a month as an Airbnb rental, if you now had to take that property back from Danny and rent it out as a regular long-term rental, the numbers are not going to be anywhere near the same. Like, you're gonna be able to get maybe $1,000 per month at best for that same house. And sure, you could always take the house back and then just flip it over to a new short-term rental manager in town, but you're gonna lose all of your reviews if you do that, and you'll basically have to start your listing from scratch. Point is, her completely just walking away from this business is putting a lot of people in a really crappy predicament. Thankfully, as far as I can tell, not everybody who ended up buying houses and then having them listed with Danny ended up completely losing their shirts here. Fox 23 uncovered that her ex-husband, William, was actually the majority owner of all of these businesses. And while they don't think that the husband was aware of any of the sketchy stuff that Danny was doing with the money, he has since stepped in. He started working with tenants to get their utilities turned back on. The ex-husband still has a huge mess on his hands though. He says that Danny took out $500,000 worth of loans that he didn't know about and racked up $350,000 worth of credit card debt before she bailed. If that wasn't bad enough, there's also records that she took out credit cards in other people's names. Another one of her former employees says that Danny took out a credit card in the name of her daughter who had died earlier that same year. What? I gotta say, based on when she started this, Danny actually really was in the right place at the right time, and had she handled things differently, she probably would have had a legit sellable business on her hands. Like, these short-term rental property management companies who are generating millions in annual revenue are able to sell for anywhere from 3 to 5 times their income. So it's not unreasonable to think that if she just stayed the course and then sold her business off to somebody, she could have walked away with a pretty hefty payday and then rode off into the sunset. Starting a business like this really was just all about having perfect timing. Like, the Airbnb business was booming back then. In Tulsa, they jumped from around 600 listings to about 1,500 listings over this window. And there was a similar trend happening in Scottsdale where I live. I mean, we still have over 5,000 short-term rentals just in Scottsdale alone as of the last report, which is crazy to me. More short-term rentals being on the market like this is good for property managers like Danny, but it's not so good for the people who own these homes, because if there's more Airbnbs that are on the market, that means there's more inventory or more supply. And when supply goes up but demand stays about the same, that means you're not going to be able to charge as much money for your house on a nightly basis, and your house is not going to be booked up as many days per month. So nowadays in markets like Tulsa or in Scottsdale, people aren't making nearly as much money as they used to be when they rent their house out on Airbnb. The good news on this story is that most of Danny's investors were able to find new property managers or sell their houses. Her ex-employees were able to find other work, oftentimes with competing property managers. And that Facebook group we talked about earlier that Danny was leading is still very active to this day, with over 1,000 local members. That's a wrap for today's episode, but before we go, there's something that I've never mentioned here on the channel before, but based on the topic of today, I guess it's kind of appropriate to bring this up. So this might sound crazy, but I actually started a short-term rental property management company out here in Scottsdale about 4 months ago. I only have one client so far, but so far it's actually going really well. The listing has been absolutely killing it. I'm up to 12 reviews with 5 stars, which means that I'm really close to becoming a super host already, which I'm very stoked about. So yeah, if any of you guys out there either have a property in Scottsdale and you're thinking about turning it into an Airbnb, or maybe you're a real estate investor and you're just thinking about buying an investment property out here in Scottsdale, hit me up. Maybe I can help you out. I'll see you guys next week.